Hare Krishna and welcome to this video on the Bhagavad-gita chapter 1 verse 1. In this video in 3 parts we will review the main points that are commented on by various Acharyas in different philosophical schools to get a more complete picture of what is going on in this Bhagavad-gita verse. And let's see here what we have in store. We have all the 10 Acharyas here, Shankara, Abhinavagupta, Rāmānuja, and onwards. And in part 1 here, in this video here, we will just cover the first 3, and then we will go on with the others in the other 2 videos. Alright, so let's start with reciting the verse. Dhritarashtra uvacha dharmakshetra kurukshetram samaveta yuyutsabham mamakaha pandavaschaivam kimmakurvata sanjayam. Dhritarashtra said, O Sanjaya, assemble at the field of religious duty at Kurukshetra, desiring to fight my sons, and certainly the Pandavas. What did they do? So here's the summary of the main points, and we start with Shankara. And we note here that Shankara, he doesn't have a specific commentary on exactly this verse, but he notes in the introduction, just prior to verse 1, he notes that Vyasadeva is a historical person. He mentions Vyasadeva by name, Veda Vyasa, and he says that Vyasa is Sarvagya, which is all-knowing, omniscient. But that is not all, for Shankara also says that Vyasa is the author of that 700-verse composition called the Gita. So not only is Vyasa a historical person, but he is also the author of the Gita. And another point is that Shankara adds that the Gita is an authoritative depiction of the actual philosophy taught by Krishna. In other words, the Gita is a historically correct description of the actual events that were taking place at Kurukshetra in northern India thousands of years ago. So the Gita is not just some poetry concocted to present some fictitious philosophy or some fantasy philosophy taught by some fantasy person. So Shankara is very adamant that the Gita is the actual philosophy taught by Krishna. All right, so now let's talk about Abhinavagupta. And he makes several points in his commentary on exactly this verse. The first point is that pada number 2 is different. This is not a point that he makes, but this is a point that I make, because we have this problem here that Abhinavagupta is using the Kashmir recension of the Gita. And that recension, that version of the Gita is different in some verses. And in verse 1 of the Gita, it is different. So when we look at pada number 2 of the different recensions, the so-called ordinary recension on the one hand and the Kashmir recension on the other hand, we see the difference. So it looks like this, that in the original, or not in the original one, but in the ordinary one, or the more well-known one, in that version, we have samaveta yuyutsavaha, and which means assembled, eager to fight. But in the Kashmir version, we have sarvakshatra samagame, and which means something like at the meeting place of all kshatriyas. Sarva, all. Kshatra, kshatriyas. So, what do we get then? Well, Abhinavagupta's real points then starts with the internal war. And so the idea is here that he mentions this point not as his own point, but as a point mentioned by other scholars already done at the time of his writing. So he says that other commentators already have suggested an analogy between the physical battlefield at Kurukshetra and the human body as a battlefield with its sense organs. So the idea would then be that there is not only a traditional war taking place on a battlefield, but there is also a very individual war going on inside of us, in which the living entity struggles with his mind and senses. So that's the internal war that is described. And then we have a point about the word mamaka. Well, the verse says mamaka, but the uninflected word is mamaka. All right, so mamaka is very important then, and why? Well, because of the distinction between those people who are acting out of ignorance and those who are acting out of knowledge. And the Kauravas are continuously using words such as mamaka, this is mine, that is mine. And this is a sign, according to Abhinavagupta, that they are controlled by their desires, which means that they are acting out of ignorance. In contrast, the Pandavas, however, are perceived as pure, because they are not controlled by ideas like Māmaka. So they're not controlled by their desires, at least not in the same way as the Kauravas, and therefore Abhinavagupta classifies them as representatives of pure knowledge. Right, so let's take Rāmānuja, see what he says, and we note here that he has not commented on this verse explicitly. But there is a comment, just like Shankara-Acharya. There's a comment just before verse 1, seemingly part of the invocation or introduction, that mentions some interesting details. And that is a point about Dhritarashtra's blindness. So the point he makes is that Dhritarashtra is not only physically blind, but also spiritually blind. Rāmānuja's implication seemingly is that this spiritual blindness is a very important factor. And maybe it's even the most important factor of all behind the war. And if Dhritarashtra, as well as his sons, of course, had not been spiritually blind, then perhaps there might not have been a war. So when we note this point of Rāmānuja's, that Dhritarashtra is spiritually blind, we may better appreciate the spiritual quote-unquote answers by Krishna that we see throughout the Gita. For Krishna's words that are coming later are not only spoken to instruct Arjuna and the warriors on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, but also they're meant to guide anyone else that is listening to these words, including the spiritually blind Dhritarashtra. So that concludes this first little video on verse 1, and we'll see you in part 2. Thank you very much for watching, and Hare Krishna.